So again, welcome everybody to the class of modeling and control of environmental systems. Today we start the second lecture. I hope you can connect or via Zoom or via the streaming on the YouTube channel, in which we will record also the lecture of today. You can find all recording of the lecture on my YouTube channel. Okay, we started last week by giving a general introduction on on modeling and control of environmental systems. Today we will start introducing some general concepts that explains how we theoretical ecologists look at environmental systems in order to model and describe them. We said last week, we said that environmental systems are complex systems. And now we will try today to give you some more hints on this concept, but is quite a cloudy concept. We'll try to clarify what is meant by complex systems and how we can measure complexity and how our point of view changes when we deal with such complex systems. Can you hear me, or the volume of this voice is too low? Okay, no answer, so I assume you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
One important epistemologic concept that we have to look at in order to understand how our perspective changes in looking at environmental system is the concept of reductionism and holism. You are all comfortable with the reductionistic approach. Reductionistic approach is the classical approach of modern science. We could say the Cartesian approach. The idea of reductionism is that the whole is equal to the sum of the parts. This sentence has some very important consequences from the epistemological point of view, because this means that if we are able to understand the behavior, the working of all the parts constituting a complex systems, then we should be able to describe the totality of the system. So the whole is equal to the sum of the parts. Classical scientific models are all based on this paradigm. Classical scientific models are based on simplification, but are necessary to reduce the computational demand. But often this kind of simplification makes the model unrealistic. One example of this unrealisticity is the Heisenberg principle. The Heisenberg principle is one of the fundamental principle axioms on which is based quantum mechanics. Heisenberg principle says that the most you know about the speed of a particle, the least you know about its position. I mean, this is a very classical story. I think you have heard it in, under various flavors during your career, but the typical way of formalizing it mathematically in physics is that if we multiply the uncertainty on momentum times the uncertainty of the position, these two quantities are always bigger than even if a smaller constant, that is the H Boltzmann constant. This means that if I reduce, for example, the uncertainty on the position, delta x, then the uncertainty of the momentum grows. And this is a postulate of quantum mechanics, one of 6 basic postulates of quantum mechanics. So in the beginning of the 20th century, when quantum mechanics was founded, scientists realized that with classical scientific paradigm, the idea of being able to describe with an arbitrary precision reality is simply destroyed by this simple sentence. So physicists have to accept the condition of a new science. So they had to accept that they were not able to know with an arbitrary precision speed and position of a particle. Something similar happens also in other realms of science, in particular in in ecological theory, when we deal with complex systems, complex evolutionary systems, we are faced several times with several of these conditions in which once we enhance our knowledge of one aspect, we are forced to reduce our knowledge on the other aspects of the reality. So in the 80s of the last century, a new way of looking at nature and science began to be employed. The concept of holism became quite a paradigmatic obligatory choice. Concept of holism implies that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And this way of looking at natural systems, looking at nature, entrains with it several consequences. From a paradigmatic point of view, the systemic approach, so what is called the systemic approach, is needed in order to describe those systems that are not reducible, inherently not reducible. And in these conditions, also there are some weird behaviors that appears, like that of chaotic systems, become normal conditions. Chaotic systems are systems for whose the estimates in the long term are practically impossible. So we can never know the world with an arbitrary accuracy. With this last sentence, you should see that there is a striking parallel between this approach, the holistic approach, and the Heisenberg principle that says that we cannot know with an arbitrary precision two fundamental aspects of realities, but for example, speed and position of particles. We are in the condition that we must accept the condition of this new science. And I will try to demonstrate today, to give you some arguments for which a systemic, holistic approach is needed when we deal with living systems that are systems inherently complex. We may say that most systems in nature are inherently irreducible. This is to say that it is not always possible to interpret observation of systems operation through basic principles. So this is why we need to resort to empirical model. How can we use model in order to interpret reality? Let's say that we have, first of all, we observe a reality, we pose some questions about reality, we develop a model. So it is a simulation models that gives you some answer, then we check, confront this answer with the reality. This is the classical way of employing model for studying reality. But in some situations, we may discover or we may employ models as tools for developing theories and corollaries. So we start from a simulation with restricted validity in which we try to answer a specific questions about the behavior of reality. And by building this model, we may employ this model to generalize into theoretical conclusions. So this is why models are so important in this context, in a context in which we cannot know with arbitrary precision all the conditions of reality. We are obliged to employ a modeling approach. So we start with a simulation with restricted validity, and we employ this simulation for theorizing, building theories with more general validity. We may say that experimental observation in this context do not produce new laws, but instead they produce a new model of a part of a reality. So in this sentence, we have two concepts in model, concepts of modeling, description, paradigm, and the concepts that we are not trying to describe the totality of a reality. Instead, the model describes only a part of a reality. The practice of modeling of environmental systems is possible today thanks to recent development in ecological theories, and we will see some example of these theories during this class, but also thanks to the computing, increasing computing ability of PCs. So this is as to say that if we are able to build a model, let's say quite complex model to describe quite complex systems, then we will need a quite elaborate computational systems that is able to deal with these complexities in terms of solving differential equations. So we may say that if even if the analysis is not enough to understand the enormous complexity of ecological systems, new analytical results may be used for the formulation of a synthesis. So we go from observation, analysis of a system, to a synthesis. Syntheses are necessary to investigate the emergent properties of systems. The synthesis or the model indicates what new analyses are required. So again, this is a kind of loophole circulatory approach in which we observe a reality analysis. We build a model describing what are our observations, the synthesis. The synthesis then guides us in conducting new analysis. So in deepening our understanding of the complex system. So, in conclusion, we may say that the word equation does not exist. The word equation, I mean the equation describing the totality of parts, elements, and behaviors of given observed complex systems. We may say that nature is simply too complex, and in being too complex, it displays nonlinear behaviors, as it is often the case. We will see that several of our model will be nonlinear, even if we know that several of our model will be nonlinear. I anticipate now, since now I anticipate that we will generally try to find linear approximation of nonlinear behaviors. We may observe chaotic or catastrophic behaviors. Chaotic has to do with the impossibility of forecasts in the long term of the status of a system, because with quite complex systems, even not very complex, like the problem of the free body problems in physics, you may recall, but even in mechanics, in classical mechanics, we are able to solve all the equation of motions of a two bodies problem. If we insert a third body, even classical mechanics produces equations that are not easily solvable for the free body problem. And then there is another significant effect, what is called the so-called butterfly effect, or sensitivity to initial conditions. This means that the behavior in the long term of a complex system is largely highly sensitive to initial conditions, meaning that even a small deviation from the initial conditions, in the initial condition, a small variation in the initial conditions may end up in a dramatic, catastrophic effect in the long term. The so-called the butterfly effect, which, so to speak, it is said that a butterfly flying in New York may be originating tornadoes in Tokyo. So, sensitivity to initial conditions means that changements in the initial condition may end up, even small changements in the initial conditions may end up in dramatic changement in the final long-term condition of the system. Of course, in the laboratory, everything is much easier. So this is why we have biologists that are able to try to draft some general laws on even complex systems like living systems. But recall that in the laboratory, um, everything is much more simple because the conditions are controlled. For example, temperature, humidity, food availability, and so on are all conditions that may be controlled in the laboratory. Things that does not happen in the real world, in which the variables, forcing variables, are so many that you are simply may not include them all. So now let's give a look at how we can look at ecosystem as an object of research. First of all, we shall recognize that ecosystems display a specific level of organizations. For example, look at a tree outside your windows, and you see that the tree is made up of structures, like for example the branches, the roots, and the leaves. These structures may be repeated, like for example the leaves. All the leaves of a tree share some common characteristics, but the analysis of this specific level of organizations requires a selection of the appropriate spatial and temporal scales. So the level of organizations, or the emergent properties of organized systems, become apparent once you select the temporal and spatial scales. Now we shall go through a couple of definitions, but help us understand what it is meant by the term ecosystems. Classically, Morowitz, 1968, said that ecosystems sustain life consistently to the actual conditions. So, a first property we may recognize of an ecosystem is that of sustaining life according to the particular conditions in which life is taking place. So we immediately see that this is a property of the entire system rather than of the individual species or population or subsystems that constitute it. So it is clearly an holistic systemic approach, the requirement of an holistic systemic approach for describing ecosystems. Then there is a more specific definition that was given by Audun in 1953. Audun stated that an ecosystem is the set of physical, chemical, biological activities in a confined spatial-temporal unit. So Audun, that was one of the first ecological theorists, theoretical ecologists, recognized that in order to define what is an ecosystem, we shall individuate the activities that are of chemical, physical, biological types that take place, and that these activities happen in a defined, confined spatial-temporal unit. So there is a spatial unit, so spatial boundaries, but there is also a temporal unit what has to do with the choice of the temporal scales. More in general, Odum says that an ecosystem is a unit of functional biotic system that, first of all, sustain life, includes all biotic and non-biotic components, abiotic components. The scales are not defined a priori, instead, the scales depend on the objective of the study. So the scales has to do with the complexity of a model that we are using to describe a complex system. So two concepts like that of complexity and self-organization seems to be relevant concepts when we are describing ecosystem. Complexity, because comes from the word complexum, Latin, that means to embrace, because complex systems embrace several hierarchical levels. Self-organization, because these systems are able to reorganize themselves in order to sustain life against, for example, the destruction forces that comes from the from the outside environment. We may schematize an ecosystem by this drawing. The pointed line defines the boundaries of the system. So first of all, we have to identify boundary. These are temporal and spatial boundaries. We immediately recognize that there is an interaction between the internal of the system and the external environment, where something is coming in, typically energy in the form of solar radiation and matter in the form of elementary components, enter into the systems, then they are processed, energy and matter are processed into the system, and then the system remits energy, typically thermal radiation, and matter in the form of wastes into the surrounding environment. This laundry machine, which we push in energy, solar energy, and we get out thermal energy, is sustained by a set of very complex physical, biological, and chemical processes. So the two categories of elements that made up an ecosystem are abiotic and abiotic elements or components like climate, geomorphology, the hydrology, and so on, but also biotic components, living things, that goes from the simple bacteria to organisms, population, communities, and so on. These elements, the biotic components, interact among themselves through biochemical processes, and these biochemical processes interact with the chemical physical processes constituting the abiotic components. So, by this description, I'm trying to point out the thing that ecosystems are open systems, open at least to the flow of energy and matter, open in input and open in output as well. Non-typically, we have solar energy entering, but sustain photosynthesis, and we have thermal energy, thermal radiation exiting, matter in the form of elementary particles, elementary components, like for example, nitrogen, phosphorus, and so on, and matter in the output in the form of wastes, for example, protein, amino acids, and so on. And through the mixing of these matter element through this set of complicated processes, we obtain the description of an ecosystem. An important aspect that we should focus on is that of internal nutrient cycling. Ecosystems, living things, can survive only if there is a consistent internal recycling of nutrients or matter. No recycling, no life. We will see some example of this. So, from the point of view of a researcher, we can say that empirical studies in which we try to assemble pieces of knowledge into an organic description is the first approach we may employ in the description of living systems. Then we shall switch to comparative studies. For example, we shall identify some functional and structural units of different ecosystems. For example, we may identify photosynthesizers. We may identify the process of photosynthesis as a functional and structural elementary part of a living thing or living system. Then we shall employ experimental studies in which we manipulate the entire system in an attempt to understand the relevant properties. And then finally, we end up with modeling or computer simulations. And we, I recall you, we go back to an analysis and synthesis approach. So modeling of computer simulations are a way of pushing further our knowledge on complex systems, but in principle, we have difficulties in understanding. All these approaches are needed in order to obtain an adequate, holistic description of a living thing, a living system. Why holistic? As I told you, systemic approach. We try to understand the behavior of an object, which is a complex assemblage of smaller objects. We may understand the behavior of a smaller object, but we are not sure we will understand the behavior of a larger object. This is a typical condition when we deal with living systems. For example, let's say we want to understand how a cat works. In order to understand how a cat works, from a reductionistic point of view, I typically open the cat and I extract the various internal organs, and I understand the functioning of the behavior of internal organs, but then I have destroyed the cat. I have destroyed the system because I've killed the cat. So if I want to understand how cat mates or chases for food, or simply where he decided to pee, or if it is happy or not, I need to resort to an holistic approach, because I cannot expect to understand the behavior of an animal by understanding the behavior of its subcomponents. So, in this discussion, we have introduced the term complexity. I have quickly cited also the term self-organization or auto-organizations. But in my view, accounts for the fact that living systems have the ability of react to external stimuli in non-trivial ways. Then, if we talk about complexity, we may or we shall discuss about order and disorder, that are informational concepts. We may say that ordered systems are complex systems, but we may as well say that disordered systems are complex systems. So complexity is not the only characteristics. We need something else to distinguish between different types of complexity. This has to do with the randomness of some processes, chaos, and this ends up drives us to the concept of organization or to the concept of emergent properties. How can we uh, study the relationship between complexity and order disorder? We may place, for example, uh, hypothetic theoretical graphs in which we put on the x-axis ordered system toward disordered system, and on the vertical axis we put the level of complexity of a system. Ordered system, like if I am a physicist, so if I think to what is the most ordered system, I can think to a crystal. A crystal, as you know, you may say it is a complex system, it's a highly ordered system, but you may say it is a complex system, but in reality, you know that in order to describe crystals, you need only 1, 2, 3, sometimes 4 integer numbers, the so-called reticule networks of Bravais. So I wouldn't say that the description of a crystal is a complex description. So in our perspective, I couldn't say that a crystal is a complex system. Now let's look at maximally disordered system. I can imagine that, for example, the explosion of dynamite may generate a highly disordered system. Again, the explosion of dynamite system, even if it is a highly disordered system, I wouldn't say it is a complex system, because you may describe it in thermodynamic terms with, for example, pressure, temperature, and volume. So I would say that maximally ordered and maximally disordered systems are not complex systems. I would put my lowest level of complexity at this point. Then what happens in between? In between ordered and disordered systems, there are systems that are able to display some kind of self-organization. And this is where typically living systems place themselves on these theoretical graphs. So living systems, in our view, are systems for which we have a maximal complexity and which display the ability of responding in non-trivial ways to external stimuli. Okay, do you have any question? Okay, so let's say what we can define in terms of thermodynamics when we talk about ecosystems. We start with thermodynamics because thermodynamics is the most holistic of all the physical approaches, the approaches of a physicist to the study of nature. If a physicist wants to give an holistic description or systemic description of a portion of a reality, it typically ends up in using thermodynamics. Because, as you know, thermodynamics represents the synthesis from the microscopic description of statistical mechanics to a macroscopic description of our observational scales. First of all, we realize that ecosystems, as we said in the beginning, are open systems. They are open systems, it says that they are crossed by flows of energy and matter. We immediately may recognize that these systems are far from the classical thermodynamic equilibrium system. The classical thermodynamic equilibrium system is an abstraction, but it is used in physics to define the state of a system. We see for some further examples of that soon. So, first of all, given that living systems are systems that are crossed constantly by flows of energy matter, for example, energy enters in the form of light, energy exits in the form of heat, these systems are not in thermodynamic equilibrium according to the classical definition of thermodynamics. Equilibrium, the classical definition of thermodynamic equilibrium is the state in which the temperature, the volume, and the pressure of the system does not vary. Does not vary. This is absolutely not true for living systems, but a system for which the temperature varies, the pressure varies as well in terms of due to the migration of different concentration of molecules, and the volumes also changes. There is a striking evidence of the fact that living systems tend to dissipate energy. What does it mean, dissipating energy? It means transform energy from more ordered types of energy, like, for example, coherent light, into less ordered or less structured types of energy, like, for example, thermal energy. In physics, and in particular in thermodynamics of a process far from equilibrium, this process is called dissipation. Dissipation, like, for example, friction is a typically dissipative process in which you have the movement of an object that may be described in terms of speed and, for example, and quantum, and speed and momentum. In a frictional process, this movement is transformed into heat, the heat due to the friction of the surfaces. Then there are other quite surprising observations we can do while looking at living systems. Apparently, living systems seems to accumulate order, or we may say to accumulate information. Why do we say this? For example, look outside your windows, look at the trees. You may recognize that, for example, all the leaves of a given species of trees share the same structural characteristics. All the leaves of a given trees are similar to a certain extent. So there is a kind of information, level of information, that is accumulated locally, and somehow it is registered because this information is transmitted or propagated to the offsprings or to the children of the living system. Another important aspect that is linked to that of dissipation is that of transformation of energy. Living systems tend to transform energies. For example, light into thermal energy, light into heat. By looking at this kind of changing of perspective, we are forced to recognize the fact that we are changing our observation to energy from a simple quantitative evaluation to a more elaborated qualitative evaluation. It is to say that we recognize that not all the energies are equal. In particular, in a living system, bioenergies have all different qualities. As to say that, for example, 1 kilogram of grass has a quality of energy different from 1 kilogram of a cow, because a much more solar energy was employed to transform grass into the meat of a cow. Another important aspect linked to the observation of living things or ecosystems is that these systems tend to grow. So besides accumulating order, they tend also to accumulation of biomass. It may be accumulation of biomass or increase of flows. But not only growth, but there is even a more intriguing aspect that has to do with development and structural change. Living systems tend to display structural changes during the history of its evolutions. Structural changes means new species coming in, or one or more species getting extinct, new flows, changement of diets, changement of environmental condition, climatic condition, and so on. All these external forcing draw what is called the development or evolution of systems. So let's give a look now to the flows of energy at the level of the biosphere from our new perspective. So we may say that the Earth may be seen as a closed system in terms of matter, apart from a small come si dice, meteoritic materials that falls onto Earth. But the point is that the biosphere is a closed to matter flows but open to energy flow system, but it is in steady equilibrium. The flow of energy is driven from the sun, our star. We may say that the stability, the steadicity of this equilibrium is maintained by dissipative processes. So it is quite, or we have argument to sustain that the stability of ecosystems is linked to the dissipative processes or degradation of solar energy, going from light to thermal energy. From a thermodynamic point of view, we may look at the Earth like an enormous thermal machine, the machine that is driving all the climate on our planet. We may say that from the equator up to equatorial to tropical latitudes, more plus 30, minus 30 degrees, there is the onset of two very big convective cells, the so-called Hadley cells. One is clockwise in the northern hemisphere and not counterclockwise in the lower hemisphere. These Hadley cells are those responsible of maintaining the steadiness, the stability of the system. A very important indicator of the stability of the biosphere is the temperature on the biosphere, and the average temperature on the biosphere on our planet is 287 Celsius Kelvin degrees, or 14 Celsius degrees, and this is an average done over all the latitude and all the yearly cycle. This means that the really average temperature of the biosphere is 14 Celsius degrees. For example, if you dig a hole and you go, let's say, some meters beneath the surface of the soil, the temperature down there is 14 Celsius degrees. 14 Celsius degrees is the reference temperature. It is also employed for calculating the effects of the so-called climate change crisis. The point is that by the onset of these highly convective atmospheric cells that are, of course, dissipative processes in which, for example, solar energy that is accumulated by the planet and then re-irradiated into the atmosphere generates these circular cells. These dissipation mechanisms is that is responsible for maintaining the stability of the system. And the stability of the system is measured by, for example, the average temperature. This figure is the average from January to December, so the whole yearly cycle, and at all the latitudes on our planet. There is another way of measuring the energy that is arriving on our planet by the sun, and this is called the so-called solar constant. Solar constant is the quantity of energy flow, so that is joule per second per square meter. Actually, the solar constant has a value of 1,360 watt per square meter, so it is an energy density, an energy flow density that measures the solar activities. We have some changement on the solar constant in the story of the evolution of our planet due to the changement of the solar activity. In general, due to the condition of our planet, we may say that 9% of this radiation is in the ultraviolet, 41% is in the visible range, while 50% is in the infrared or thermal range. So the large part of this radiation is infrared, while another large part is visible. This subdivision in the different spectra of the solar radiation is due to a particular specific working of the sun nowadays that is measured by the solar constant. Of this radiation, the surface of our planet receives directly 26% and indirectly 25%. The ultraviolet radiation is almost totally absorbed in the stratosphere, so the higher layers of the atmosphere, between the 20 and 100 kilometers, by gases like oxygen or ozone, gaseous ammonia, and so on, gaseous nitrogen, and so on. The infrared part of this radiation is almost totally absorbed in the troposphere, that is up to 10 kilometers in height, by gases like CO2 or NO2. But as you know, these are typical greenhouse gases, those responsible of the greenhouse effect. So if we give a look on how this energy is subdivided, if we call 100% the energy that arrives on the upper atmosphere of our planet, so 100%, we call the solar constant. So I forget to tell you that this value, 1,360, is measured at the intermediate distance Sun-Earth. Because of course it changes depending on the distance from of the Earth from the Sun. So let's say that we have a solar constant quantity of energy arriving on the planet. If we make 100% this quantity, 35% is immediately reflected by dust, gas, clouds, albedo, and so on. 90% is immediately absorbed in the atmosphere by ozone, steam, clouds, and so on. of what it is left out is the 46% that is absorbed by the Earth directly and indirectly. Indirectly means re-emitted by atmospheric gases. This 46% is both responsible of generating all the very energetic movements that are linked to tides, currents, and so on. Atmospheric circulation on the whole accounts for only 5% of this energy. So it is the heat of evaporation and convection. And then 46% is re-irradiated by the Earth toward the atmosphere. The gases in the atmosphere re-irradiate 19%, so that the total is 65%. So that the total storage ends up to 65 plus 35, 100%. So this is a stable, steady condition that is necessary to maintain the stability of the systems of the biosphere. That is a condition necessary to ensure the persistence of living systems, the thriving of life on our planet. I have anticipated that in our perspective, not all energies are equals, or means not all the types of energy have the same quality. Let's say if we convert the 1,360 watt per square meters into kilocalories per year, totally directly incident on the surface of the planet. So this is trivial conversion of units from watts to square meters. So there is an integral on the year and an integral on the surface of the planet. Then we obtain a figure of 1.2 10 to the 22 kilocalories per year, that is the quantity of energy that arrives on our planet from our sun. Then of this energy, terrestrial vegetation and phytoplankton, that are those living objects that we refer to as primary production. So the first step of conversion of solar energy into biochemical energy, use 2.5 10 to the 20 kilocalories per year. Of this employed energy, they produce biomass that accounts for 5.2 10 to the 70 kilocalories per year of biomass. And if you make a ratio, this simply accounts for an efficiency of a transformation of 0.2%. So it is a very low efficiency of transformation from solar energy to a primary production, or the primary step in the chemical conversion. We may synthesize this by these steps of conversion. We may say that sunlight with an efficiency of 0.2% is converted into the biomass of primary production. Then from this, with an efficiency of 3%, there is a conversion of the biomass of primary production to the biomass of herbivores. So that are those that feed on biomass, feed on the biomass of primary production. And then the upper trophic levels may have an efficiency that are much higher, for example, going up to 40% for some carnivores. So you see, you start to see now, to understand what I mean by different quality of different energy. When I say that a unit of energy of primary production has a different quality of a unit of energy of herbivores, I am meaning exactly that in order to arrive to a unit of energy of herbivores, we have two subsequent processes with two very different efficiency, 0.2 and 3%, and so on for the upper trophic level. So I would say that 1 unit of biomass of carnivores has a much higher uh, quality in terms of energy content of 1 unit of a biomass of a primary production. I understand this may sound a little bit weird to you. I will try to explain you a little bit more in detail. First of all, what is primary production? In order to understand what we mean by energy associated to a biomass, we shall understand the first process of conversion of energy, solar energy, into biomass. This process is called photosynthesis. Typically, it is a production process. The primary production is a production or synthesis of organic molecules. So we are going to simple elements like, for example, nitrogen, phosphorus, silicates, and so on, to much more complex organic molecules. For example, carbohydrates, proteins, and so on. The reverse process of production is called consumption. Biologists call consumption fermentation or respiration. What it is consumption is the conversion of organic molecules into essentially ATP, adenine triphosphate, that is the fuel for our cellular processes. ATP is an energy carrying molecule. So, what is the energy that is fixed by primary production and transforming or organizing, synthesizing, structurizing elementary elements, basic elements like nitrogen and phosphorus, silicates, and so on, in organic molecules, is transformed by the reverse process of consumption back into energy that is transported into the whole cell by the ATP molecule. It is important to notice that different living object has a different content in terms of energy per unit biomass. For example, plants contain 19 kilojoules per gram, algae 21, invertebrates 23, and vertebrates 26.3 kilojoules per gram. So now you understand that different types of living objects have a different energy content. How do we measure this energy content? We employ the calorimetric bomb mechanisms in which we burn totally 100% particular quantity of biomass, and we measure the difference between the employed energy for burning and the energy produced by combustion. The difference corresponds to the energetic content of that particular material. In particular, we may notice also that different types of organic molecules contains different quantities of energy. For example, carbohydrates 16 kilojoules per gram, proteins 20 kilojoules per gram, lipids has the highest content of energy, 27 kilojoules per grams. Of course, these figures are consistent with these other figures, meaning that plants have a different content of carbohydrates, protein, and lipids that end up in these figures 19.2. Again, vertebrates has a higher content of lipids and proteins, so that they end up with a higher content of energy per unit biomass. These figures are very important to ecologists because allows easily to pass from energy currencies to energy content, energy measures into biomass measures, or vice versa, to biomass quantities measures into energy measures. How is it possible that this happens nowadays on our planet? In order to give you the right perspective, in terms of time and spatial scale, in particular timing scale, I would like to describe you briefly the ages in the evolution of life on our planet. So we will discuss now very quickly, briefly, how life has appeared and evolved on our planet. In the evolution of life on our planet, we may distinguish three main eras. First one, prebiotic eras, that goes from 4.5 to 3.5 billion years ago. 4.5 is more or less the average, the age of our planet. So our solar system is 4.6 or 4.7 billion years old. Then once the Earth was formed, let's say 4.5, we had to wait at least 1 billion years or something more to get the first living things appear. So the second era, the era of the microcosm, happens from 3.5 to 1.5 billion years ago, and is the period of evolution that is dominated by microorganisms. Then we have to wait until 1.2 billion years ago, more or less, to switch to the third era, the so-called macrocosms, and this is the era in which all macrocosmic living things appeared, so the things that we are looking at today. So it is important to recognize that the bacteria, microcosms, have dominated for at least 1 billion more than 1 billion, 1 to 2 billion years, the planet. And they have dramatically changed the structure of our planet, of our environment. How did they change it? So they changed this by changing the atmospheric conditions, adjusting, for example, the levels of humidity, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, or oxygen, 21%, or ozone. Please note that nowadays on the Earth, our atmosphere is made up of 21% oxygen, and this concentration is the least concentration possible to have a biochemical process like the one of oxygen respiration. Below this concentration, oxygen respiration wouldn't be possible. Above the 21% concentration, you know that oxygen is a comburent, so it fosters combustions. So above the 21% concentration, you will have cell combustion. So our planet will be a very will be an hell, very unpleasant place to be. In order to cast this story on the whole development of the planet, I find very interesting to make a linear projection on a 24 hours day of this story on a clock like, or a turtle, or a pie like graphs. So for example, the upper graph would represent the night from zero, so from the birth of the Earth. We have to wait until, let's see, 2.5, 3.5 billions of years ago in order to see the first living things appear. So we have a large part of the first night in which life was not yet on the planet. Then we have bacteria that appeared, and then they dominated the rest of the night. We had to wait until 10 in the morning for the bacteria to invent water photosynthesis, that as we now know is the key process for the primary production. Then, since then, we have the day starts, let's say, and we have to wait until noon in order to eukaryotic bacteria to appear. Eukaryotic bacteria are a sensible evolution of the prokaryotic bacteria. Prokaryotic are the simple emerging living objects. Very simplified. We will see some example of that on next lecture. Eukaryotes are much more complicated living organisms in which, by symbiosis, probably several prokaryotes bacteria stuck in order to build more complex structure. Then we had to wait until noon of the day in order to have aerobic respiration. Do you understand aerobic respiration? This means that from this point on, there may be invented some processes of respiration based essentially on oxygen. Then we had to wait until 21, what means 9 in the evening, 9 p.m., in order to find the first invertebrates. Invertebrates are worms. From 9 in the evening, then we go on, origin of reptiles, amphibians, fishes, seeding plants, angiosperm, insects, 10 in the evening, superior reptiles, conifer, mammals, and birds, dinosaurs. We have to wait until 11 in the night. Angiosperms are plants with flowers. Dinosaur extinctions happens at 17 past 11 in the evening. And the origin of modern mammals, 38 million years ago, it is some minutes before midnight. The hominids appear 3 minutes before midnight. The hominids here, I mean Lucy. And then we had to wait until some portion of seconds before midnight in order to have Homo sapiens. And 40 hundredths of seconds in order to base history like we know it today. So you see that in terms of the evolution, we are very, 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 very lately organisms. We appeared on the planet very lately, so we are just the last appearing. The significant part of the story is that bacteria that dominated for the whole initial part of the story have changed significantly their environment by setting up and regulating the atmosphere, the quantity of water, and so on. And the important part of the story, again, is that humans that appeared very, very lately, in the end, took a very, very short time span to cause important changes on the situation of the planet. So this has to do with climate change, with greenhouse gases, or with the effects of industrial revolutions and so on. But took very, very short time compared to the dramatic changes that bacteria employed several millions years to take on. Okay, if you don't mind, I would stop here now because I'm finishing my voice. If you have any question, I stay in the class and I'm ready to answer to your questions. Otherwise, we will see next Thursday at 9:30.